We've made it to the last month of this year. I honestly don't know where 2025 has gone, but I do know one thing. The Trump administration is still playing the same tired game with Russia. They're sending their people, Steve Witkoff and reportedly Jared Kushner, to Moscow to meet top Russian officials right after sitting down with Ukrainian representatives in Florida on Sunday. Marco Rubio, now wearing the hat of Secretary of State, comes out and declares that the 4-hour meeting was productive, but in the next breath admits, So what does that actually mean for the state of the talks? Are we on the verge of a serious, concrete proposal that Russia could accept, or is this just more theater, a way to keep the war burning on the battlefield while Western politicians pretend to chase peace? Let's be clear. Trump imagines that this is a two-man arrangement, a grand bargain between himself and Vladimir Putin with everyone else's background noise. In his mind, he and Putin are the masters of this war, and they're going to resolve it. But this is not a two-way situation. It's at least three-way, possibly four-way. You have Washington, you have Moscow, you have Kiev, and then you have the Europeans, especially the leaders who are desperate to keep the war going. Not every EU or NATO member is excited about this conflict. Some would gladly see it end tomorrow. But the core war party, the UK, France, Germany, is still very eager to spend more, escalate more, and squeeze whatever they think they can get out of this disaster. They are, in many ways, bit players pretending to be giants, the European chihuahuas of this conflict, constantly yapping, not particularly serious militarily, but still influential in narrative control and media spin. They want to manipulate events to their advantage. And from their own point of view, that's perfectly understandable. But it doesn't make them strategic adults. Trump, meanwhile, is trying to treat this as if there are only two real players and that everything can be settled between Washington and Moscow. It doesn't work that way. Every time he tries to move something with two parties, the European chihuahuas rush in, yipping and snapping, disrupting the process, insisting on their own conditions, their own illusions, their own fantasies about NATO expansion and permanent leverage over Ukraine and Russia. Underneath all of this, a lot of the war in Ukraine has always been about markets, market control and market creation. American markets, European customers. Energy markets, arms markets, subsidy markets, let's control that. Let's lock that in. Energy, military hardware, so-called aid, that is really just money cycling back to Western corporations. These are the real prizes for many of the people pushing this war from the Western side. Trump wants to control Europe, but he also wants Europe as a customer. He wants to dominate them and sell to them at the same time. That's his mentality. So when he tells Zelensky, you don't have any cards, you're losing on the battlefield, and we're going to do this my way, he's not wrong on the facts. Ukraine is losing on the battlefield. And his vice president, J.D. Vance, says the same thing openly. Now, for years, you weren't allowed to say that in polite Western discourse. Now the Overton window has shifted. It is finally permissible to acknowledge that Ukraine is losing and will keep losing every day, worse than the day before. Zelensky knows this. The Ukrainian leadership is not stupid. They know the army is being ground down. But the Europeans, the chihuahuas of Brussels, Paris, Berlin, London, still believe they can extract more value from this war by postponing peace, even though Ukraine has already lost physically, financially, militarily. The war is lost for Kiev, yet Europe still wants to claw back its sunk costs, still wants to recoup political and strategic investments that are gone forever. It's like a bad investment. You buy Bitcoin at 160,000 and then it drops to 80,000. You want the 80,000 you've lost back, but that money is gone. That is called risk. You played the game, you lost that hand. Europe made a catastrophic strategic bet on using Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia, and they lost. They shouldn't have a meaningful voice at the table now but they keep inserting themselves anyway, demanding that their losses be magically reversed. Inside the U.S. machine, you have characters like Rubio and others in the State Department who line up with this European perspective. Witkoff, by contrast, works for Trump personally. He's Trump's friend, tied to him by long-standing relationships and money. Kushner is cut from the same cloth. Trump trusts these people because they are fellow oligarchs. They are his circle, but Rubio and his State Department loyalists want something different. Rubio craves European approval. He wants to sustain the illusion that Europe can still win something out of this mess. They cling to dreams of NATO expansion, of stationing NATO peacekeeping forces in Ukraine, of locking Ukraine permanently into the NATO orbit. They have lost those things. Russia is not going to give them NATO expansion on its doorstep. Russia is not going to accept a NATO-controlled Ukraine. Yet the West still demands precisely what it can no longer achieve. For a long time, Trump had an 82-year-old general advising him on Ukraine, someone who was very much in the NATO camp, steeped in the European worldview. That man is gone now, but Trump hasn't gotten rid of Rubio or others of the same mindset. So what you end up with is a cacophony. Trump wanting a transactional cut of the post-war pie, Europeans wanting NATO gains and geopolitical leverage, neocons wanting an eternal anti-Russian front line, all talking at once. Everyone has a different agenda. How are you supposed to forge a coherent peace framework out of that chaos? Meanwhile, Russia sits like a Cheshire cat on the other side of the front line, proceeding methodically, deliberately, in a way that is cost-effective for them. Yes, Russia has paid in blood and treasure, but not at a level that will cause it to abandon its objectives. On the contrary, it is advancing week by week toward what it set out to do. It is succeeding in its terms. Russia will keep moving until there is either a settlement on the ground, effectively a surrender by Ukraine, or a political peace that acknowledges the fundamentals of this war. Russia's legitimate security concerns, the status of Russian-speaking populations, and the neutralization of Ukraine. That is precisely what Europe does not want to acknowledge, and what even Trump does not seem to grasp. I'm not convinced he even knows the fundamentals of this conflict. The Europeans and the neocons in successive U.S. administrations certainly knew them. They wanted this war. They still cling to the reasons they manufactured it. They cannot face the fact that they have lost. So you have a clash between reality and fantasy. Russia lives in the former. Western elites operate in the latter. It's revealing to watch Trump play at being a third-party mediator, as though the United States is some neutral referee hovering above the conflict. Moscow certainly doesn't see it that way. Russia doesn't waste time haggling with Zelensky, a man who's arguably not even legally in office anymore. They go straight to Washington because they understand that any real deal has to be struck with the Americans. Kiev is not the principal. Kyiv is a proxy. And yet, nearly 4 years into this war, Western politicians still do not grasp reality. They still spin fantasies about keeping Kiev on life support long enough to bleed Russia dry, when in fact the opposite is happening. This is a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, the side with greater industrial capacity, greater manpower reserves, and stronger political cohesion wins. That side is Russia, not Ukraine. At the same time that Ukraine's manpower is being hollowed out and its economy is collapsing, the West parades peace frameworks in the press, 28-point plans, 24-point plans that any serious observer knows Russia would be insane to accept. These are not peace plans. They are PR documents meant for media consumption in the US and Europe. We've seen this kind of thing before. Look at Trump's 20-point peace plan for Gaza. It was just a list of vague bullet points, short and confusing, with no appendices, no implementation schedules, no timelines, no enforcement mechanisms. A real peace plan is a detailed document. It includes annexes, monitoring provisions, timetables, verification procedures. It reflects serious work and, crucially, a degree of mutual trust. Trump's Gaza plan was theater. The Israelis never truly agreed to it in their hearts, and there were no consequences for ignoring it. Now we're watching the same show over Ukraine. A 24-point plan, a 28-point plan, then fewer points, then a new list, all superficial. Even the idea of a ceasefire is treated as just another point on a list without any serious thought about how it would be implemented, monitored, or stabilized. Ceasefires are complicated. You must anticipate loopholes and bad faith behavior. None of that work is being done. This is purely for public consumption. Russia, to this day, has not been formally presented with a serious, agreed-upon framework. What we have is a Western circus performing under its own tent, with Russia watching from a distance, occasionally amused but largely unimpressed. I'm not saying peace is impossible. I'm saying concrete steps have not yet been taken. The West is still playing at optics. To really understand why European leaders are so determined to keep the war going, you have to look at their domestic situation. The loudest advocates of war in Europe are in extremely fragile political condition at home. Macron is the most obvious example. He's dissolved his parliament repeatedly. He's widely despised by his own population. The party of Marine Le Pen keeps surging, and that pattern repeats across the continent. Populist, nationalist, anti-establishment movements are rising, not because Europeans woke up one morning and decided to be far right, but because they are sick of economic decline and catastrophic policy failures. These establishment leaders are deeply invested in those failed policies on energy, migration, industry, EU centralization, and they are equally invested in this war. The Ukraine war is just one more shaky stick in a very unstable Jenga tower. Pull that stick out, admit the war was a mistake, admit it was costly and pointless, and the whole structure risks collapsing. Admitting defeat in Ukraine would force a reckoning with every other error of the last 15, 20 years that has degraded European quality of life and destroyed European prosperity. You can see the structural decay. Europe's industrial base has gone through what the American Rust Belt went through in the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds.
Think of Ohio or Pennsylvania, once productive, thriving industrial regions hollowed out into shells of themselves. That's what is happening in parts of Europe now.
They are not ahead in any major industrial sector. Asian competitors are eating their lunch globally.
Their demographics are terrible. Aging populations, fewer young people, a declining workforce. When countries are in that kind of trouble, political elites often turn to war. War becomes a distraction. It refocuses popular anger onto an external enemy. It's not our fault. Your living standards are collapsing. It's the evil Russians. They're going to invade us. We must fight them. And so they manufacture a hysterical narrative. Russia, which they also describe as slow, incompetent, losing tens of thousands of men just to take a small slice of eastern Ukraine, is somehow going to sweep across Europe and conquer Berlin, Paris, London. The same people who say, look, 4 years and they only hold a sliver of eastern Ukraine also say they'll be in Warsaw next if we don't stop them. The contradiction is absurd. It tells you you're dealing with propaganda, not analysis. Zelensky's own political survival, meanwhile, is visibly approaching its end. There will come a point where he either has to flee the country or be placed under some sort of protection arrangement because the bill for what has been done to Ukraine will eventually come due. What Washington, Brussels, Zelensky, and the Nazi elements in Ukraine have done to that country is catastrophic. The reckoning will be ugly. Any serious peace framework should contain a section, a real section, not a throwaway line, on post-war Ukraine and accountability. Instead, the only thing that seems to be clearly written into Western ideas is how Trump will ensure that he and his circle get a cut of the profits. That's not a peace plan. That's a racket. While the West plays games with PR documents, Russia maintains a clear and legally grounded approach to the war. The Special Military Operation SMO was announced, described, and authorized through a formal document approved by the Russian parliament. It is a state policy, not a personal whim. If Putin dies of old age tomorrow, the SMO does not simply evaporate. It continues as a state-backed operation with defined objectives. From a military perspective, the This is almost textbook. Clausewitz said war is politics by other means, but he also assumed clear political aims, coherent guidance, and constraints. Russia's operation is guided, public, constrained, and anchored in state law. The objectives do not shift wildly with changes in leadership. Compare that to the United States, which has not fought a war with clear, stable objectives since World War II, perhaps with the tiny exception of the Grenada invasion, which lasted a few days and was limited precisely because it was so small. Vietnam is the classic counterexample. Presidents changed, policies shifted, and the war drifted aimlessly while men died, and a country was devastated for generations. There were no fixed, legally defined goals, no stable national consensus. That is the American pattern. Russia has opted for the opposite: clear objectives, stated in advance, and adjusted only when absolutely necessary, with real continuity. Why did Russia launch the SMO? Because there was a civil war in Ukraine. Russian-speaking populations in the Donbass had voted with their feet and at the polls for autonomy. They had been guaranteed that autonomy under the Minsk agreements. Those agreements were signed, endorsed, and supposedly binding. The West then ignored them, undermined them, and used Kyiv to continue waging war against the Donbass. Imagine if, during the American Civil War, a foreign power had intervened decisively on the side of the Confederacy, supplying weapons, trainers, intelligence, political cover. In fact, there were fears at the time that France or Britain might do exactly that, and even limited French help was enough to cause panic in the Union. The basic rule is simple. You don't interfere in other people's civil wars. But the first major interference in Ukraine's civil conflict came from the United States and NATO, not from Russia. They armed, trained, and emboldened Kyiv to carry on the war. Putin's main domestic criticism in Russia was not that he was too aggressive. It was that he waited too long. Many argued he should have moved earlier, that he was too hesitant, too patient. Russia eventually intervened, not in a rage, not in a chaotic emotional burst, but in an orderly, state-directed way. That, again, is what historians will study: the contrast between Russia's structured approach and NATO's improvisational, politically driven chaos. Russia's goals are not mysterious. It intends to secure the Donbass and other Russian-speaking areas that were promised autonomy and then betrayed. That likely includes the Donbass, possibly Zaporizhia, possibly Kherson, areas already largely under Russian control or in the process of being absorbed. Some speculate Russia will go all the way to Odessa. Odessa is deeply Russian in history and culture, but there is no sign Putin intends to march to Odessa just for the sake of it. He has repeatedly indicated he will do what he said he would do: protect Russian populations and secure a neutral Ukraine. Two of the regions involved have already become part of the Russian Federation through referenda. It is quite possible two more will follow. Western critics scream that these votes were not truly voluntary because they occurred during a war. But the same people are silent about Ukraine's own back-to-the-wall mobilization. Kyiv has hundreds of thousands of citizens facing charges of desertion. Draft-age men are snatched off the streets. The conscription age has been widened in both directions, pulling in the very young and the very old. Men in their 60s are being told to suit up. If that is not force, what is? Ukrainians are being coerced to fight. Russians in contested regions are voting to leave a state that is forcing them into a hopeless war. Force is absolutely a factor on both sides, yet the West only acknowledges it when convenient. The broader truth is that the West, particularly the United States, bears heavy responsibility for this war. There is an entire sector of Washington, people like Victoria Nuland, the late John McCain, and their ideological allies, who openly wanted this confrontation with Russia. They helped light the fuse in Ukraine. Because of that, the United States will have to be involved in ending the war. It is not a bystander. It is a principle. Russia, for its part, will continue the SMO until its minimum strategic objectives are met: a neutral, non-NATO Ukraine and secure conditions for Russian-speaking populations. Moscow does not envision annexing the whole of Ukraine. That would be a nightmare in terms of cost and governance, even if it were militarily possible. What Russia wants is what any major power wants on its borders. A neutral, stable neighbor, something like what the United States has with Canada and Mexico. We trade with Canada and Mexico. We travel there. We benefit from their relative stability. That is what Russia would like on its western frontier, neutral neighbors with whom it can trade and live in peace. Instead, the West has sabotaged energy flows, destroyed infrastructure, and tried to sever trade between Russia and Europe. The Nord Stream pipelines were blown up. Russian energy flows were deliberately replaced with more expensive American energy. Washington did not want peace in Ukraine. It wanted a rearranged energy and security map in Europe with Russia boxed out and America in control. Trump is not fundamentally different in that regard. He simply wants to monetize the new arrangement more openly to extract a bigger personal and national cut. And as the war in Ukraine inevitably winds down, whether through Russian victory on the ground or a forced, grudging Western compromise, the American system looks for the next battlefield. That's where Venezuela comes in. The President of the United States goes on social media and declares to the world that all airlines, pilots, drug dealers, and human traffickers should consider the airspace over and around Venezuela closed in its entirety, as if a tweet can declare a no-fly zone over a sovereign country. Meanwhile, U.S. forces in the Caribbean, including those on the USS Gerald R. Ford, are reportedly rehearsing strikes against Venezuela. This is not a joke. It is a likely prelude to another war. Why? Because every time Washington winds down one war, it feels compelled to start another. The military-industrial complex is not a slogan, it is a structural reality. The system demands new contracts, new theaters, new justifications. As the Ukraine war winds down, and it will, Venezuela's enormous energy reserves become the next target. Venezuela has massive oil and gas fields, both on land and off its coast. Trump wants to control those resources. He sees himself as an emperor of the Western Hemisphere, entitled to decide who may exploit which reserves and under what terms. The pretext, as usual, is a lie. American agencies that monitor drug flows know perfectly well that Venezuela is not the main source of narcotics entering the United States. The drug trafficker narrative is a prop. The invented gang names and dramatic language are theater for domestic consumption, meant to convince Americans that yet another intervention is about protecting them from criminals, when in reality, it is about oil and empire. Trump already tried to overthrow Maduro once through a ridiculous coup attempt fronted by a nobody, a friend of the Rubios of this world, and it failed. Now, the Nobel Peace Prize is handed to a Venezuelan opposition figure who, under any normal criteria, would be seen as an armed revolutionary rather than a saintly peace icon. That prize looks engineered, an instrument in a broader plan. Trump himself, obsessed over the Nobel, demanded it and didn't get it. So now the prize becomes a spotlight shown on someone Washington would like to lift into power. Maduro reportedly explored the idea of some form of amnesty or relief from U.S. sanctions and bounties because he doesn't want his country destroyed. Trump refused. He doesn't want a negotiated arrangement. He wants control. At the same time, Trump pretends he can declare no-fly zones by tweet. He couldn't even do that over Ukraine when Zelensky begged him repeatedly for one. Now he plays at being a global air traffic controller over Venezuela. It's not a real no-fly zone in legal terms, but it does signal his willingness to escalate, and that's dangerous because the planners around him are incompetent. It is not difficult in today's world to sink a carrier in the Caribbean if the situation spirals. A single spectacular loss could trigger a 9/11 style political response, and suddenly Venezuela could be subjected to full-scale devastation. And then there is the environment, something Europeans pretend to care about passionately. They posture as defenders of the planet while supporting outright genocide and the physical destruction of Gaza. They arm and apologize for that destruction. They cheer policies that litter Ukraine with unexploded ordnance and mines that will take decades to clear, if they are ever fully cleared at all. Russia will likely clean up the territories it controls. Who will clear the rest? A shrunken, bankrupt rump Ukraine? The same European elites who can't even keep their own industries running? The environmental cost means nothing to them when war is on the table. Venezuela sits near critical headwaters of the Amazon. It is a mountainous, ecologically rich country with extensive coastline. A major war there could do incalculable damage to ecosystems, not just human beings. Yet the people who lecture the world on carbon footprints are quite prepared to light that region on fire if it serves their strategic and economic interests. The American leadership class has proved itself unworthy of the American people. We like to imagine